Good day, everyone. This is James Jude with Wipro. I'm part of the data analytics and AI practice. And this is the second in a series of AI-driven and CDO-driven podcasts with industry experts and leaders. I've got with me today somebody I'm absolutely delighted to have join. I met him about 9 months ago at a Domino RevX conference. And he sits on top of the hottest topic area in one of the largest companies in the world, John Thompson from Ernst and Young. So John, why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself? And then I wanted to ask you about your journey with AI and data and all good things, including the books behind you on the shelf before we end.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, James. It's so nice to see you again. Our conversations are always wide-ranging and fun, and I'm so excited to be here. So thank you for inviting me. And hello, everybody. Going to be an interesting conversation today. And as James said, I'm the global head of AI at EY, which is a great title. And what I do and what the team of over 400 people do at EY is that we build all the AI tools and technologies for the 420,000 people that work at EY. So I've been working on AI for about 35 years at this point. I got my hands on the first neural network program back when IBM created Neural Network Utility version 1. I think it was around 1980 or 79 or something like that. I was always spouting off that I thought AI was going to take over the world, and most people thought I was crazy at that point. So for all my enthusiasm, they put me in a windowless room in Rochester, Minnesota for a week and said, see if you can make this work. And from then on, I was just fascinated by it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has been quite a journey. You and I were talking a little bit. The interesting thing about AI's journey is that some of the basic concepts that, AI is built on even today, what is language? What's a noun, a verb, an adjective? How do you map that to different, languages? Not everything can't be English centered. A lot of that was solved in a formal logic way decades ago, and yet it wasn't practical in any means. Knowledge management was extraordinarily expensive because of the training cost.
Yes.
And now effectively, with AI learning by example, we train for free. We're going to get to the question of if that's good or bad, because learning by example also means who gives the examples and can you game that example and deliberately harm the system, which is now an entirely different problem. But that's a fascinating journey. And I think that what we used to call AI, which with things like Lisp and complex logic has now become, creating a poem for my son's birthday party or are having a call with a chatbot. We're going to get into that in just a moment. So I think that's really interesting. But John, one of the things that struck me in the 2 years since Gen AI really took off and became, a hot topic. And I think OpenAI set a record for the number of new signups, for a website and things like that. And I was part of that, hundreds of millions. I'm wondering if we're going to be disappointed, not the AI winter of the 1980s that, you and I remember well because we got excited about it and the funding went away, but disappointed in the sense that I'm thinking back to the early days of personal computers. And you can tell by my gray hair that I was there at the very front. I actually owned an Apple II, which was 2 months' salary of my engineering job when I graduated from college. But it was very simple to hand draw slides. We gave presentations. We made our point. When PowerPoint came along, or before that, Harvard Graphics, I was able to produce professional quality slides and professional quality decks at very low cost. It elevated the quality of what I was doing. But did it change the wording? Not at all. What it did was everyone was then expected to rise to the occasion. Those who didn't have PowerPoint had a brief period where they would pay people to do professional decks until they caught on. But did it really change the dialogue? Has PowerPoint really improved our world versus courier font text on a slide? And I would argue that it probably hasn't. I'm not going to give it up because at this point it's an expectation. And you can't not have it. Just like email, you can't not have email. Do we think that there might be a point at which AI just kind of does everything we do now, only helps us at the nibble at the margins? Or do you think there's use cases, and I want to pivot to that conversation, where it really, really is going to change the world?
I understand the argument and the posit and the theory and all that kind of stuff, but I do think that AI is going to change the world. I do think all those things are true that you said. That I'm teaching at the University of Michigan in addition to my day job right now, and I have a group of students, and their homework assignments are starting to come in. And I can tell exactly the ones that were written by ChatGPT or Cohere or Anthropic. And I just politely ask them, hey, which model did you use? And they always come back and tell me. So I think that these things are useful, they are helpful, they are going to help us do better, faster, cheaper. But we're in one of those periods. We're not going to go towards an AI winter, and we can talk about. I have a very unique view of why those AI winters came about, but I do think that now, as we move forward through Gen AI and causal AI becomes more interesting, and foundational AI gets integrated with Gen AI, I do think that this whole conversation about agents, while it's a little overblown right now and it's a little early, I can see where we are going to be able to build AI-based agents, and they could be symbolic AI, they could be neurosymbolic, it could be all of those things. I do think that they're going to make a huge difference in how we process information, how we approach problems, and how those problems can be solved in a dynamic way. So for now, most people see what you laid out, James. Is it just a better way to do word processing? It is, but it's not. That's not the end of it.
Yeah, I suspect actually it'll split into multiple levels in much the same way that computing we know has revolutionized supply chain. It really has. And
Yeah.
yet, it also sits on someone's desktop or their laptop and, helps them do the same job they would have done 40 years ago.
Hmm.
What's interesting to me as a student of history is I think of the disruption of the Industrial Revolution. There were moments where you suddenly had, 100 people doing the work of 1,000. A cobbler, for example, losing his job
Yep.
to a machine. If
Yep.
that takes place very, very quickly, there's tremendous social disruption. People died in market squares, over the question of where does that profitability go?
Yep.
Do you give the 100 people the same salary as the 1,000 and pocket the difference, or does it elevate the salaries and they can then spend it on other things?
Yeah.
We haven't hit that pivot point yet in AI, but I'm wondering if there's
Yeah.
going to be a moment where half of the claims adjusters, half of the underwriters, half of the office workers find themselves unemployed in 10 years when we suddenly hit that moment of transition. Or if it's going to be like what happened to professional artists when PowerPoint came out. You
Yeah.
know,
I do think that's coming. I don't think it's 10 years away. I think it's more like 5 years away.
okay.
But we've always navigated, there's always the story of bank tellers, that
Yeah.
bank tellers were, when ATMs came out, and I was working in the banking industry when ATMs came out, I wrote, a small part of the infrastructure to make ATMs work, which was rather dull, but I did it. But now we have more bank tellers than ever. If you look at it, the proliferation of branches and the ease of use and people still wanting customer service and all those different things that come about. So I think we'll see, and I also grew up in Michigan in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So, I lived through the whole decimation of the auto industry
Yeah.
due to robotics and offshoring and the rise of Japan and all that, those kind of things. And I'm a keen observer of social dynamics and economic disruption. So I do think that people that are our age, and we are pretty much the same age, will have problems in the workforce transitioning into an AI augmented or AI supplanted, work environment. But on the other hand, we'll see lots and lots of young people coming out using AI, and they'll do the work of 10 people, and they won't know it because they've never seen what it looked like, 50, 60 years ago. but they won't get paid, the wage of 10 people. They'll get paid the wage of one person, but they'll be hyper productive. So, just like we've seen, lots and lots of different jobs pop up, AI will create all sorts of new jobs. So I don't think that there's going to be a real problem in society in any geography. I think AI is going to be a net job creator. The friction that we see for the most part will be in the older workers who don't have enough time or don't want to transition to the new world. I think that the new world will emerge organically, and I think it will be easier for the younger people to actually leverage it. I mean, it was harder,
Yeah.
when some of the disruptions weren't as easy to adopt. You remember, when you were programming and you were learning. I mean, I was learning BASIC and assembler and PL1 and COBOL and RPG2 and all these other languages, which were hard for people to learn. They were archaic and difficult to use. Now, the languages, I think, seem to be much easier to understand. And it's not as much, when I watch some younger people programming now, they don't program the way you and I did when we started.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We would sit down in a text editor and just write a program. They're in an IDE and they're taking a piece of this and a piece of that and going grabbing a library and bringing this together, bringing that together. Not that they're any less creative or better than we were, but they do it in a much different way. It's more of an assembly process than it is a writing process, has been my observation. But to get back to your original question, I don't think it's going to be really a hardship, a broad-based hardship in any economy in this transition. I really don't see it.
I think it may be, but no different than we got with robotic automation. As
Sure.
you mentioned, I mean, that was difficult.
Mhm.
And it led to a lot of disruption, but I don't think where we could undo that.
Right.
So that to me is the real thought is we want AI to touch every corner of our experience, to predict our keystrokes, to anticipate our desires. We get weirded out when it happens, but annoyed when it doesn't.
That's such a great observation.
Yeah,
I hear that
exactly.
all
I
the
mean,
time. It's like, well, it should do that. But then why is it doing that? And it's
yeah,
like,
like why
okay,
isn't Netflix giving me better choices? And like how did it know I like that genre? And I think that, and this is good. I think we're going to create more things with that 10x improvement,
Mhm.
rather than having us have a 1990 style technology base done with 1/10 as many people.
Yeah, I think we're
Um,
going to have I just read an article that was mentioning it earlier today, the Jevons paradox. When coal-fired, boilers and steam engines, actually were easier to operate, the use of coal, skyrocketed. So it wasn't supposed to be more, it was supposed to be more efficient and you'd use less of it. But because the use cases exploded so exponentially, everybody was using coal. And I think that's going to happen with programming as well. You hear people saying, oh gosh, no programmers will exist and they're all going to be extinct and we'll have to go to the museum to see a programmer. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's going to happen. Not in my lifetime or my children's lifetimes. Programming is still going to be a
yeah,
very valuable skill. It's just going to be used and done more widely.
yeah. To think logically about the steps that lead to an outcome is a talent, no matter what, even if you're in finance or marketing. So if we talked about that split, that sort of nibbling on the edges at the desktop. I mean, I constantly have AI asking me if I want to rewrite, a message to someone on LinkedIn. And is that helpful? Well, not for me, but it might be for someone that English is a second or third language.
Sure.
But then you've got AI that's deeply, and fundamentally changing the way in which we, discover drugs and detect cancer and things like that. At EY, given your user base of hundreds of thousands of talented people touching almost every country in the globe, how do you deal with your use cases? How do you?
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you two questions as we pivot to this. How do you balance that desire we've always had with technology between let a thousand flowers bloom and encourage self initiation versus centralization, talent centralization, and corporate control, and bring that to an AI world? How do you encourage use cases that are non-trivial? So in the
Yeah.
course of this next 40 minutes, I really don't want to talk about, oh, a chatbot, was better and Oh, it summarized the document and found the obligation clauses in a legal, contract. That's been solved. I want to get to, what really caught my attention 9 months ago when we met. What are your use cases? How do you find them? And more importantly, how do you get EY to think about use cases? I don't care about how you find them. How do you bring an ecosystem? A lot of my members listening to this are responsible for data literacy. They get dinged if it's not up, and they don't get praised if nobody knows how to measure it, but they get dinged for it. How
Yeah.
do you bring good ideas forward, and how do you sort them out? That's a very
Yeah.
long introduction. Sorry for the
No,
long
no,
talk.
it's a great couple questions. And when I joined EY just as OpenAI was releasing ChatGPT. So, with my title, Global Head of AI, I was soon called in front of that's called the General Executive. It's the 8 people that run EY.
Yeah.
So they called me forth and said, "Okay, you're the newly minted head of AI. What are we going to do?" And I said, okay, well, I think what we should do is I gave them a litany of recommendations, and the gist of it was we should open it up to everybody in the world and let them get their hands on it. And we should allow them to do, certain things, other things we can control. We should allow them to put any kind of data into it whatsoever, and we should fund it centrally. So it can, no one has to worry about costs and things like that. And we should let that run for at least a year. And they
Right.
said, okay, go for it. So what I did then is I went and I spoke to EY is a large professional services firm, and it's a very conservative, highly regulated organization. So I went to risk management, data privacy, legal, and infosec. And then I said, all right, you're the four groups that are going to shut me down if I get out of control. So what are the bright lines? What are the things that I have to stay within so I can enable 420,000 people to work with this stuff? And they were very clear. They're like, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. And there were like 5 things that were like, do not contravene these things. So we built this environment and we let it go. And, not only did we build this environment that does all the things that you said in the intro, we also gave people the ability to provision their own sandboxes. So
Yeah.
we had about 300,000 people on the massive platform, and we had about 2,000 groups provision their own environments and build their own applications. Now, there was a lot of repetition, and there was a lot of just trying to figure it out and tire kicking and all this other kind of stuff. So that's how we let 1,000 flowers bloom, actually a few 100,000 flowers bloom. And we did that for a year, and we paid for it. And it has paid off immensely. Nobody
That's,
got in trouble.
yeah.
Nobody got in trouble. No one got off the ranch. Nobody did anything that hurt the company. We never ended up on the front of the AFT or the Wall Street Journal. So I'll stop there and let you react, and then I'll go after your use case question.
Yeah, and by the way, congrats to your management team for recognizing that and doing. And then you said you were going to try it for a year, because I'm going to ask you how you carried that forward. Um, but that's really, really interesting. And I assume maybe I shouldn't assume. I'll ask you. I don't want AI calculating my bank balance. I
No,
mean, when you and I started programming, a lot of it was numbers, and the text was almost secondary. It was to label the numbers.
tertiary.
Whereas almost everything we do now in computing is really around managing, movements and subtlety and the gray areas. So
Yeah,
I'd be interested in, what use cases there were. I'm assuming that didn't fundamentally change the audits, or maybe it did.
it did not.
Okay, but it might have changed the amount of labor that went into a final report. It might have changed
Yes.
the amount of, yeah, and that would be good, because it also
Yes.
helps to standardize across the quality of people as they work up their career path. You can get a
Exactly.
consistently good outcome, and it's
Mhm.
not an accident of who was assigned to the project.
Yes. So
Um,
in those 2,000 groups that provisioned their own environments, there were a huge number of them that went off and built chatbots. And that was fine. We wanted them to do that. We knew it wasn't going anywhere, but we wanted them to feel
Now, I'm
confident.
just curious for a moment. Are these customer-facing chatbots, or was it internal knowledge management?
Internal.
Yeah, got you. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was like build whatever you want, a chatbot to write sonnets to your puppy, or, write you, in itineraries for your Vermont vacation or whatever it happened to be. People did all sorts of stuff that was not going to be productive or useful. But the point was for them to learn how to actually interface with Gen AI. They didn't really care what they built. Now, there was a small number of people that built really interesting use cases. Some of those, one of them was to generate proposals for clients. Another was to understand tax liability for expats. So there
Yeah.
were some that came out of it that were very, very useful and interesting. So, we ran that for a year. And then, as you said, we decided, okay, the corporation has funded this long enough. Now we're going to turn it, and you could continue to use this massive environment. It's still out there. It has about 300,000 people on it on a continuous basis.
Wow. Yeah.
But the individual business units pay for it themselves. So every time you go on and use it, you get a bill, at some point in the month. So what has come out of the use cases in EY is that generally what we have done in an organic, natural way is we have looked at ourselves as client zero. So where we see our operations being inefficient or ineffective or too slow or too many people or too costly, we turn AI on it. And we do things like this one that I talked about, this proposal generator. In EY, it takes 2 juniors, 2 seniors, and a director to generate a proposal for a client. It's usually about 2 to 3 months in duration. Now,
Yeah.
that's a complete proposal, something you're going to send to a client. We built an environment. It's a retrieval augmented generation environment, and there were tons of those built as well, in addition to chatbots. And, it's one person answering a handful of questions, and you get an initial proposal in about 4 minutes. So, the initial part of that process has now been cut down to one person for 5 minutes. So,
Yeah.
the generation of a proposal, the first month has been completely compressed away.
Right.
Now
Exactly.
you have something that you can use. You can bring those 5 people to bear on something that is substantially correct. You can edit it, you can change it, you can add pricing to it, you can do anything you want. So those are the kind of use cases that we've been working on over the last year. And when my team builds things, this environment, this large environment that I talk about is called EYQ. If you're a fan of James Bond, the character Q,
Yeah.
that's the name of it. So, what we've done is I'm a software person. I'm not a professional services person. So when we built EYQ, we built it dual purpose, that we could use it internal and we could sell it to people. So, there's a number of customers that have purchased that, because people show up and they say, look, you've got something that's serving, substantially the bulk of your employees around the world. We haven't been able to do that, or we don't have the time to do it. Can we buy yours? And the answer is yes. We sell it to them.
Yeah, and as a business model, you have an economy of scale with your hundreds of thousands of employees and contracts that a single company on its own could not build a learning base large enough to. Most of them could not, right? They don't
That's
float
true.
enough proposals or answer enough.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating too, John, is I'm sure they have AI on the other end. It's like one of my favorite cartoons where someone's asking AI to turn 8 bullet points into a presentation, and they mail it to a client. The other side, it asks AI to turn the presentation into 8 bullet points.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
setting aside that probably very real humor, um, and back to our industrial revolution question, that's the kind of thing where you're not going to have half as many partners or half as many sales reps or half as many proposal writers.
No.
It is a real lift of a burden,
Yes.
but it's not the kind of thing that you've changed the company.
No.
The day may come where it's fully automated, but that's an entirely different theme.
That's a ways down the way.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting example. And when you talk about now, each group pays for their own after the 1 year experience, you get them, hooked on it, and they're gladly do it. That's the old sort of time sharing model, which makes sense. I'm curious, though, the things like a language model. So if there's an LLM around tax audits, and there's an LLM around legal, there's language of art in different countries. Words have a very precise meaning. That's one of the use cases we've been working on at Wipro, is making sure our clients don't just use, the language model that generates a poem for your dog, but the language model that understands, legal contract boilerplate. Do
Yep.
you centralize that, or is that something that, you still allow them, who basically there's a real skill to building an LLM, Have you centralized that, but allowed them to then execute it on their own, or how have you balanced that?
It's a great question, James, and not many people are actually having this dialogue. I think they will in the next year. We looked at it. We started asking this question about 9 months ago, and I kept asking people, "Do you think we're going to have 5 LLMs, or are we going to have 2,000 language models?" And as many people as you asked that question, you got answers.
Yeah,
Everybody had a different thing to say about it. My view is that, the LLMs are here to stay and they're great. They're fantastic. OpenAI, Mistral, love all their models, think they're fantastic. But we're moving into an era now of domain language models or small
yes,
language models. And that's what you're basically asking about, at least in my parlance. So we've gone out and we've built multiple DLMs or SLMs around different subject areas. And they work pretty well, but you have to realize that not many organizations, even to the scale of EY, have enough information internally to build models of high quality. So you have to go out and work with Thomson Reuters and Springer and all these
yeah,
content owners and license their content and bring it into this model that you're building. So in my conception of the world, there's going to be the LLMs, then there will be thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of DLMs and SLMs. And then, down at the small end where we were working before, large language models, BERT and Roberta, NLP models, I call those
yeah,
tiny language models. So I don't think many of these environments, and most environments don't operate, is a prompt model, kind of environment. They operate more as prompt, orchestrator, planner, many models. That's going to be the architecture that we see in the future. So it's starting now. It's not widely proliferated, but if you go and look at companies like Mistral, their mixture of expert models is exactly that. That's the architecture that's going to proliferate.
yeah. And I think that for small and medium-sized companies, there's a business opportunity for someone to develop industry language models and sell them. In much the
Absolutely.
way that ERP has in many ways standardized, the tremendous complexity in file formats and layouts and quality that I saw, 30 or 40 years ago. It's now people are using one of two or three packages and they interoperate. I think we're going to find that,
Yeah.
that sort of language model becomes something that can be shared. I'd be curious to see at some point whether or not there's industry trade groups that offer that. Will National Retail Foundation have a model they offer their members? Will the Blues, Blue Cross Blue Shield, a loosely, organized confederation there in healthcare, will they have a model?
Mhm.
Or will they be afraid to raise their hand and sell it in case that there's a lawsuit?
Yeah, all those things could be true. I've
Yeah,
been talking to a variety of people inside EY, outside EY, as models as a service,
yeah,
because, someone could come in and say, hey, we want to have a large language or a DLM, small language model around tax for not-for-profits in Estonia. You
yeah.
know, we don't know how to build it, but we would love you as EY or some other large tech company to build it and maintain it over the next 5 years. That would be a really great business.
Yeah, and actually at Wipro, we're looking at that, serving that role ourselves. Not that I want to get salesy. This is a podcast, but that's a very interesting point because I think to bring this technology to the small and medium market where there's tens, if not hundreds of millions of businesses, is going to have to take that. The biggest companies can always brute force their way into the leading edge of a technology,
Absolutely. Yep.
but to make an impact. Which leads to, I'd like to pivot to another topic that I think is kind of interesting. So, we are not in this call. There's plenty of good TED Talks. We don't have to talk about where LLMs come from or what they mean. But I'm fascinated by the idea that in many ways, Gen AI does not seem to know what it's doing. And by that, I mean, it almost seems to me like an average, especially, okay, I realize image generation is very different than text, but let me just go with some image examples. Um, that if you ask LLM to show salmon swimming upstream, our Gen AI imaging, people have done this. It's online. It's hilarious. You have pictures of salmon. It knows what salmon looks like because it sees it from grocery stores. It knows what a stream looks like, and it puts these chunks of, salmon in the water.
Salmon steaks.
Yeah, exactly. Salmon steaks swimming upstream because it really doesn't have a concept of salmon in its various stages of growth and processing like a human would. Another example was someone was trying to get it to draw a wine glass filled to the brim. Well, it goes out and finds pictures of wine glasses. The average wine glass is half full. It brings a half full wine glass and then it tries to put like drops of wine. It doesn't know the concept of a glass, the wine, and a brim. Our mutual friend Shell Carlson was trying to get it to draw 5 grilled shrimp on a salad, and it knew shrimp salad, but it didn't know what a shrimp was and what a salad was. Yeah. Are we going to be able to tell LLMs, you've read the tax code, and you really got it down, but can you separate those elements that understand depreciation from the elements that understand penalties or rewards or the like? I'm sure I sound stupid to somebody from EY that knows this stuff. But do we think that Gen AI has yet understood the concepts? Or is it sort of writing the average poem or the average story or the average picture?
It does not understand, and more than likely it will not understand.
But could it be trained to do that? Could we train LLM to say, like, I want you to understand what a grilled shrimp looks like? And by the way, in the hierarchy of shrimp, here's what shrimp look like in the wild, processed, grilled. Do you think we could force it to learn that?
We can. The very prescriptive scenarios, like the one you just put out there, sure, we can make it do that. Absolutely. The thing that I don't think LLMs or language models have the capacity to do is reason. We hear from OpenAI that 3 reasons. I don't think it does. I don't believe anything they say in this realm because these models infer, and they infer very, very rapidly, and they infer on massive scales. Inference is not reasoning. So I think that they're making it's a marketing thing, so I guess it's fine. They're making a leap from one capability and they're implying another capability that does not exist.
Yeah.
So, my upcoming book that we'll talk about later, The Path to AGI, lays out very clearly that we are a long way away from AGI. And part of the reason is just what we're talking about. These models, I can't remember who said it, they're stochastic parrots.
Yeah.
They're very good at parroting back different things that we want, sometimes in an absurd way, salmon steaks swimming up a river, but sometimes, for the most times, good enough that it works.
Because actually, as humans, that's effectively what we are.
Yeah.
Is we're borrowing phrases from every book we've read or every conversation we've ever had.
Right. But the thing that these models are missing is the ability to make leaps and have aha moments. They can't do that. And I don't think they will ever be able to do that. We're walking down the street and, you showed me some of the books that you read earlier about the Gemini program, the Apollo program, and all of a sudden you're walking down the street and you're hit by a realization because you were looking at the moon as you're walking along about the synthesis of this information that you've had in your head for 5, 10, 15, 50 years. Yeah. That is not going to happen with large language models. It does not happen. It will not happen. I think as we go forward, this kind of reasoning and logic and those kind of things will come, but they will come in hard-fought battles that are not even glimmers in the eyes of scientists. We're going to have to see the amalgamation of predictive AI or foundational AI, causal AI, and generative AI to have these kind of things happen. And we're nowhere near that at this point. So, Gen AI, is that the path to reasoning? I don't think so.
Do you think a step forward, though? I want to get to the causal in a moment and really dig into that because that's a topic I don't think my audience has heard much about. But do you think that ability for someone to tell LLM or to train AI, listen, it's not just find the average picture of shrimp. I want you to understand the life cycle of shrimp. And, you could basically map it just like you would train somebody on how a factory works or an office. Do you think we could do that, but just haven't gotten there yet because we're still wowed by the statistical parroting? I mean, could we not have it understand, what a wine glass is separate from wine is separate from brim?
Oh, we definitely can. We definitely can. But what we're saying here is we're almost taking Gen AI back to symbolic AI.
Yes,
And,
that's correct. Yeah.
we're prescribing. Remember the rules-based systems that we used to build? They got so big and so heavy and so brittle because we had to describe everything to them. And once they got it, it worked, but it was impossible to maintain it. Now, what I'd said earlier about the Gen A, the not the Gen AI, but the AI winters. If you go back and carefully research every AI winter, they were all caused by symbolic AI, all of them, every one of them. And what we did is we overloaded symbolic AI with all these expectations. And then when symbolic AI fell on hard times and neural networks took off at the same time, the three guys from Toronto took their chance to put their boot on the throat of symbolic AI and say, see, it never worked. This is the way to go. But that's really not it either. All of these things have to come together to achieve flexible, rational, programmable, extensible reasoning and logic. And that's how we're going to go forward in the future. So this idea that we
Yeah.
overload one version of AI and it's going to be everything for us, too simplistic, not going to happen.
John, I wanted that just a thought just occurred to me in a way, if that the higher level computing languages created assembly language. I learned assembler in computer engineering just so we would understand what chip design was. We didn't throw out programming. We basically built layers that took care of it. I wonder if the answer to this is to go back to symbolic AI so that, you have explainability and that whole topic, which we probably can't even get into here. But you and I manually constructing symbolic AI is just overwhelming. Plus, the cost of discovering what you should tell it and the cost of telling it are overwhelming. But what if Gen AI created symbolic AI and then you could look at it and you could trace how it ended up? That
You,
might be a
you,
way, especially
you,
on things that are structured, like bank accounts and tax
yes,
advice. Again,
yes, yes.
structuring a symbolic AI to write a poem, I really don't care how it wrote that poem. But
Yeah.
there's still stuff where I wanted to do known deterministic outcome.
The
Yeah.
great thing about it is that Gen AI is an enabler of other AIs. Part of the reason that causal AI has taken off so slowly is that if you sat down a normal business analyst or a normal professional and you said, write me, and you taught them what you were asking them to do, write me high quality causal pairs. This causes that. They can't do it. It's impossible. Most people just don't even understand it. They think they understand causality. The clouds are here, it's raining, that kind of thing, but they don't. But Gen AI, since it's ingested most of the world's understanding of causal, generates great causal pairs. So you can use Gen AI to feed causal AI. Just like you were talking about, James, you can use Gen AI to create symbolic AI structures. So when they start working together in an integrated, interrelated way, they actually make each other better.
So I want to pivot here. You've actually covered a little bit on causal, but I want to make a section here where we talk about causal AI. That is a book you've already written, and I'm sure it's in the path of. I'm going to ask you at some point too to kind of show off your four children and the fifth one on the way and tell me more about them.
Right?
Um, But let's talk about causal AI. So for the benefit of me and those who are listening to this section, how would you describe it? Why does anyone care? And what problems do you think it can solve? And then we'll talk about how do you
Yeah.
get to where it's useful.
Yeah, causal AI is an emerging area. I think it's been emerging for quite some time. Most people aren't aware of it and don't care about it, but Judea Pearl out of UCLA and his compatriots have been working on this for about 45 years, 50 years, and they've created an entire new branch of calculus, do calculus, that allows you to bring data forth and analyze it in a way that you understand, what truly causes something. X causes Y. So, when we've been doing analytics for the last 38 years that I've been doing it, it's all correlative.
Yeah.
We think, therefore that, and when I was young, early in my career, I would always ask my mentors and people that were teaching me, shouldn't we be working harder to understand causality? And they're like, no, it's too hard. Correlation is fine. It's good enough. That's just what we're doing. So we've now gotten to a point where the due calculus and the other academic research and efforts have now moved into early stage software companies, Causal Lens and different companies that are out there, have actually generated enough high quality software that is robust and reliable enough that you see companies picking it up. There's one use case that this one company likes to talk about. It was a baker. In the morning, they'd start out making these buns and they'd throw away about $1 million worth of production because every day is different. It was warmer, it was colder, it was, humid, more humid, less humid, all this kind of stuff. And they went in and said, look, if we did a causal analysis and understood what the day was before it started, we could hone in on a little bit more heat in the oven, a little bit more rise on the dough, a little bit, that, tinkering with it. And they ended up cutting it down to where they were wasting like $100,000 worth of production.
Right. So in addition to predicting demand, maybe people want something when it's cold or hot, you could also predict quality. John, that reminds me of one of my favorite use cases. The company I work for did not do it, but I read about it, where they were looking at warranty claims over long periods of time for cars, and a lot of it was paint quality and paint chipping and the like. And that time delay between cause and effect is a very tricky problem in analytics. It's one thing to say, we've lined it up, but they recognize that the day where there was a certain humidity and temperature and that sort of thing, with the paint was, 2 years later, they were getting warranty claims on paint quality. And that was a breakthrough because no, traditional analytics would anybody have the time to sit down and say, oh, today I'm going to compare this against 2 years late. I'm going to do this. The computer ran through those millions of combinations while they were sleeping, and came up with that. It sounds like your Baker problem. That is a really interesting thing. And I'm sure there's similar, impacts on corporate outcome.
Right, exactly. And when we see people using foundational AI or predictive AI and causal AI and generative together, you end up with some really interesting ecosystem insights. The whole idea of generative AI just parroting things out, okay, fine, but until you actually get to why something is being caused, you can't really close the loop on that entire analytical realm or analytical cycle. Like you were saying, you do need causal for these various problems that, in some cases they have time lags of, like you said, years.
Exactly.
But you have the data set. It just depends on how you condition it. The other thing that I love about causal is that you can take data that's been used there, that was generated decades ago, and you can condition it in a way that you can bring it into your analytics. So if you understand how to do data management in a causal environment, pretty much the entire world's repository of data is available to you. So, not everything's going to line up for every other thing, but, let's say that you were doing an analysis of maybe breast cancer growth, and somebody did a study back in the 1950s that was really high quality, that was relevant, you can use it. It's very rare to be able to have an analytical capability or family that you can actually use data that might have been generated 100 years ago. And causal allows you to do that.
It's especially valuable when it's got a named entity that you can track. So, in that case, like imagine if you did the study in the 50s and you had the names you could track down, maybe n equals 1,000, find 500 of them, it's even more valuable to know. I'm wondering if this would be considered causal or not. One of the things we were speaking about earlier was, the insights and the aha moments. So you're familiar, I'm sure, with the Freakonomics series by Dr. Stephen Levitt. I don't know if you've read them or not, but Steve's a friend of mine, and I actually I had him on a podcast, and I taught one of his sessions at U of C. He wanted me to speak to his students. But what we talked about on the podcast was the question of could AI actually create, think like a freak? Could it create, these sort of Steve Levitt insights, the weird sorts of
Yeah.
things? Some of them were natural experiments, which I absolutely love. You're familiar with that phrase, but for the audience, that's where you didn't design it that one city had a program that, offered a certain social benefit and another didn't. But that's a fact. And you can look at the outcomes. You can find out whether accounting for other factors of economics and the like, did you get different outcomes? He wanted basically AI to be able to think like a freak and do, come up with these bizarre insights. I was skeptical that it could. And I don't know if we're ever going to find out that you'll be able to have AI look at data and come up with these interesting, really bizarre, like, wow, case studies that he came up with. Would you consider that causal reasoning? Is the kind of things he's come up with, like, the terrorists, often use the same ATM within 5 minutes of each other. And that was one way in which they were able to identify, money laundering and bad behavior in the UK. You know, who would have
Yeah.
thought of that, right? But
Yeah.
but it's a behavioral thing, but it's a data thing.
Yeah.
Is that causal or is that a whole different thing? And do you ever think we'd
I,
be able to come up with factoids, like really interesting factoids to
I'm not sure that it's causal. It seems as if it is more pattern recognition and pattern understanding than it is causal. But I mean, once you did your pattern recognition and you boiled it down, it could be causal. I always think of these things as chains, different chains of AI being used in different ways. So I could see how you could do predictive and then use the predictive output as a causal and then come out the other end and say, yeah, these folks for some reason seem to cluster around these activities. I would imagine not only related to the ATMs, you could probably find that they eat at similar restaurants. There would be all sorts of things you could go look into their behavior and come up with ideas that, oh, well, I believe that they will be here.
Yeah, and of course the false positive problem on, extremely rare events, even if even if your algorithm would detect 99% of the bad actors, doing robbing or something, that same feature applies to 1% of the 100 million that you didn't tag.
Yes, exactly. That
I
is
don't
an
know if
issue.
I don't know if we're going to solve that or not, but that would be an interesting thing. So I think to wrap up the causal thing, you just tied it together. That goes back to the theme we had earlier, is maybe it's not asking Gen AI to do something, but asking Gen AI to create, to vacuum the world, sort it out, and get some data that you can feed a more conventional AI model.
Yep.
Either create traceable symbolic logic or create something for, a neural net or create something just for classic statistical analysis. Because cutting, and in an age where we measure almost everything all the time, one of my clients used the phrase, there's got to be an economic order quantity concept of data. There's a point at which analyzing the data, even though it's already digitized, is more expensive than the slight uplift you get. How do we know what data you have to look at right now and what data you can sample and is very slow moving? Demographic trends, preferences, they're not going to change that often. Or
No.
maybe they do. How do you catch that moment when there's been a shift in political influence?
When there's an inflection. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, how do you catch those inflection points without constantly monitoring trillions of rows all the time?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if we're going to solve it, but I think that what we need is something to teach AI, Gen AI, when it's vacuuming and sorting, what are slow moving attributes, what are fast moving attributes? Maybe that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, and I agree, and the real challenge, you said the real challenge, I'll just restate it, is that, what happens when a slow moving indicator becomes a fast moving indicator for a short change?
Yeah, we saw that with the financial collapse in 2008.
Yeah.
Right. What
we
we're
saw
considered.
That with COVID.
Yeah, you're exactly. Yeah. What we're considered, permanent measures of
March of 2020. I was working in a biopharmaceutical company and all our models were working exactly as we expected them to. And then 2 weeks later, they were gone. The whole world had changed. So we had to recalibrate everything that we did, and many people, non-technical, non-math, non-analytical people showed up and said, oh, see, these models, they were never any good. It's like, no, the world just changed,
One of my retail clients said, I never had a model that had revenue at zero. I had models for competitive inroads or economic collapse, but never zero. You know.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, so tell me about your children in the background there. A 1 minute summary in the book, and then I'd like to pivot briefly to your predictions for 2025, 2030, and 2050.
Sure, absolutely. So, there on the shelf, starting from the far side, there's a book called Analytics. It's a little dated at this point. It was written 7 years ago. It was basically to help people. When I was working at Dell, I was traveling the world, and when I was talking to non-technical executives, you could tell that they were just absolutely confused about analytics. So I wrote a book for them that they could read on a quick plane ride about how to create an analytics function in an enterprise organization. So that's the first book. The second book is on the other end. It's the dark one. It's called Building Analytics Teams. I have built and managed so many analytics teams that I just thought nobody really gets this. Because most people, if you go talk to a non-technical executive, they think an analytics team is a software development team. That's
Yeah.
exactly what they think. So I wrote that book to say they are not. As you know, James, an analytics team is more like a group of rock musicians than they are, programmers. So, I wrote that. That's been my most successful book to date, and that's what my class at Michigan is based on, is
Ah,
that book. Then there was Data for All, which I wrote because I felt that most people didn't understand. When you went on Facebook, or when you used your credit card at a gas station, or when you went and bought something at Jewel or Piggly Wiggly or Harris Teeter, what happened to your data? So I wanted to write a
yeah.
book for just everybody to say, this is what's happening to your data, and you actually have control of it. You just don't know it. So there was that book, and then the last book that I released was Causal. We talked about that a little bit. And then the fifth book just went to the publisher, is a book called The Path to AGI. And
Yeah.
it talks through foundational AI, predictive AI, generative AI, causal AI, and where we're going to go over the next 100 years.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. Perhaps in a year or so, I could have you back and see how both the book went as well as your predictions. But this, I
Yeah.
could see, would be a nice touch point for you and I personally, and for our audience. So, what do you think is going to be the big thing this year? I'll give you mine super quick. I'm disappointed that 2024, I did not still see any significant use cases that went beyond better chatbots and better document summary.
Yeah.
Game
Yeah,
changing. Um,
it didn't go as far as we had hoped. And I think that's more of a judgment of the people that are using AI rather than AI itself. I don't think that we were creative enough or smart enough or aggressive enough in using it. I think 2025, we're going to see the foundations being built, much as it's already there, for agentic AI. There's 150 companies out there that say they have the foundations for agents. That's going to go like the car industry. 2
gotcha.
years from
Yeah.
now, there'll be five.
Yeah.
you know, and what I'm working on right now is building out what we call AMP, the agent management platform, because you're going to have all these, AutoGen from Microsoft, and Crew AI, and Vertex from Google, and all these different people building agents, but nobody's really building a management platform. So I
Yeah,
thought,
John, that reminds me of a great quote I read on LinkedIn, and I should remember the author, but I forget. He said, IT is going to become the human resources of agents. In much way, the real HR has to manage not only, acquiring them and motivating them and firing the ones that don't work. IT is going to have to do that to the human-like, agents. And I thought that was a
it's
brilliant idea.
it's so true. It's so true. So yeah, I think 2025 is going to be, agentic. That's where
Yeah,
we're going to go. And I think agents will do a lot of the things you had hoped that AI would do.
yeah,
Agents are the next level of abstraction on top of the model-based infrastructure. So it's going to be process oriented, it's going to be governed, it's going to be, all these different things that you want it to be. People ask me about agents. How do I think about agents? And I hate the idea of anthropomorphizing AI or models, but I say the best way to do it is think about anything a person can do, you can program an agent to do.
yeah, yeah. Except for maybe the most creative, fringes. But you're right. If you have a playbook on how to manage a claim, And it's basically algorithm. I've got many healthcare clients, these 400 pages books on, if it's this and it's Tuesday and they didn't, brush their teeth, and
Boom, boom.
decline. That could
Yeah,
all be algorithmic, and it could be
yeah,
explainable on
yeah,
top of it. What
yeah.
about
And to your
2050?
to
Oh,
your
sorry, go
point,
ahead. Yeah.
I'll go to 2050 in a second, but to your point, some people say, oh, AI is going to take away the creativity. I don't think so. I think
Yeah.
AI is going to make human creativity even more valuable. You
Oh,
know,
absolutely.
there's
We're
going to
gonna
be
do more stuff.
all sorts of stuff out there, but people have an appreciation for quality, and they have an appreciation for symmetry and beauty in creative endeavors. That will be highly valuable. That will never be devalued by AI.
Yeah, exactly. And back to a point I made earlier, I believe that there's still so many unsolved problems, or just unmet needs. I wouldn't even call them problems, that
Yeah,
we're going to use this, tenfold increase, hundredfold increase to do 10 or 100 times more stuff,
yeah,
rather than everything we do now with 1% as many people working.
yeah.
That's my
So
prediction.
back to your question about 2050, at 2050, we will have composite AI, and that will be foundational, predictive, generative, and causal integrated together and working as one. Then what I'm saying, in 2250, we'll have AGI. And
Ah,
that's where we have, an AI that is as smart as the average person. So,
yeah.
all these people that are worried about AGI taking over the world, and Sam Altman says it's here, and Elon Musk says we all need to be worried about it. Your children's children's children, 8 generations from now, have to worry about it. You don't.
Yeah, and worry may not be the right word. Maybe at that point, your children's children can take advantage of it. Let's hope that that's the case.
Let's go out on a hopeful note. Yes.
John, I could talk to you for another 8 hours, but I know you have a real life, and I do appreciate this. And I actually would love to have you back as a regular. I think that
I would love
doing a
it.
snapshot and an update would be perfect. So thank
That
you
would be
so much for your
fantastic.
time.
James, I could talk to you,
And
as you said, for hours. It's been a real joy. I can't believe an hour has passed already. So thank you for
yeah,
the time and the invitation.
okay, take care.
Take care. Bye bye.